50 years ago today, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gave women the right to vote. On this anniversary, a militant minority of women's liberationists was on the streets across the country to demand equal employment for women, care centers for mothers, child abortions for anyone who wants them, and general equality between women and men.
The second wave of feminism in the 1970s was and is what inspired and created the modern-day woman. The stereotypical ideas of child bearers and wives of the 1950s and 60s were quickly questioned and replaced, since the 1970s, by women doctors, politicians, and stay-at-home dads. While the movement did not happen all at once, the movement sought to change the roles of women in society and extend both their rights as independent people as well as their sexual health rights. During the 1960s, women were not allowed to do their jobs while pregnant. They were not allowed to have their own bank account or credit card, and did not have access to safe abortions. Seeing the challenges that women faced inspired both young and old women to become activists, and while they both held protests and lobbied in Congress, they were divided by generations, which somewhat hindered their ability to be effective. Acclaimed author Kate Millett's book, Sexual Politics, became one of the common and radical guides for completely dismantling the patriarchy and achieving equal rights for women. And at 35, she was one of the most important figures who represented the younger women's more radicalized ideals and goals. She eventually came out as bisexual as well, which was controversial as the women's movement, led by the older generation, tried to separate from the fight for homosexuality, while the younger generation knew that it was a connected issue and continued to fight on behalf of homosexual rights. For the older generation, their activism was a more reserved approach to women's rights. They believed that the patriarchy should not be completely dismantled, but that they needed to tackle legislation to create change. They created a national organization for women's rights, founded by important activist and author Betty Friedan, called the National Organization for Women. This organization popularized feminism, and they made it their goal to pass the Equal Rights Amendment in Congress and the House of Representatives. The interesting part about this amendment is that it was first introduced in 1923. However, it did not pass Congress or the House until this organization pushed to have it passed by Congress in 1974. Even then, it was not ratified by the required 38 states to become an amendment. Regardless, this was a huge barrier momentarily struck down for the women's movement, as prior to this legislation, equal rights for women were not explicitly protected under the law. This allowed for women to advocate for more legislative changes, such as the 1972 Title IX of the Education Amendments, which stated that sex-based discrimination was outlawed in any government-funded educational programs. This meant that more women were reaching for a higher level of education, and in result, the percentage of women graduating college went from 8.2 to 13.6%, growing by approximately 0.58% each year, an unprecedented growth in that area. Societally, the 1970s was the most perfect time to bring about social changes with the role of women. In 1960, the FDA approved the first oral contraceptive drug, and suddenly, women had much more control over their life and family plans. This triumph for women's reproductive rights gave the women's movement the steam it needed to encourage the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, in which the Supreme Court legalized abortion for women in the first trimester. These two changes allowed women to think about doing other jobs, and on the back of World War II, leading up to the 1960s, the economy allowed for 2/3 of the jobs to be filled by women. This allowed for women of all kinds to break gender roles and advocate for more job opportunities in fields previously dominated by men. Because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there was also a push to prevent help wanted signs to only apply to the male sex. After advocating for this, there was a Supreme Court case in 1973, the Pittsburgh Press versus Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, that outlawed this type of discrimination. The women's movement made such an impact on the lives of current-day women that every time a woman enters her home, enters her work, and walks on the streets, the work of the women of the 1970s is evident within her lifestyle. Every working woman, politician, women with no kids, and housewife are affected by the legislation and societal changes made in the 1970s. And while it may seem like there is now equality, we must continue fighting for equal pay and an equal role in power positions. As politicians in this day and age are threatening to overturn cornerstone cases in the women's movement, such as Roe v. Wade, our lives are fundamentally connected to the women that fought for our reproductive and human rights, and it is our responsibility to carry that torch onward. I can't keep quiet.